All right, we're back on Double Fries, No Slaw. Doug, Rohan Law, looking as dapper as ever, of course. Whether you're in a good mood or bad mood, we'll try and put a smile on your face here today. Doug, we got news from the ACC, ESPN. Very anticipated, very expected that this agreement would be just that, agreed upon, that this extension would be acceptable to both sides and that they would move forward. There are some stipulations. There are some angles of it that maybe are beneficial to Florida State and in Clemson in nature too. But just overall, this is not unexpected.
Well, I'm happy. I'm not happy to admit. I will admit that I was wrong and surprised, and will take some of the heat for what is happening because I really thought that ESPN would use the deadline to get secure commitments from the ACC, ESPN, or sorry, FSU and Clemson. There is a question about the validity of what we're hearing because anybody can say anything. And until you have pen to paper, there's really no way of knowing what's coming next. That's why it's a deadline. They call it a deadline for a reason. David Hale and Ross Dellinger were talking about this agreement has been in work for months. They've been talking about this, working on it. I don't know that I necessarily buy all of that because it's very common for lawyers not to work on things until the last minute. Yes, this is a huge deal. Yes, there are a lot of hands in the pot, but I would have liked to have seen something more concrete on the litigation front prior to ESPN going ahead and signing this extension. The ability of ESPN to guide and direct this really appears limited because the contract extension has been signed. So that begs the question, what really is going on behind the scenes? Just to kind of flesh out and fill out some of the information we're getting so far, there are reports that the ACC is in talks with Clemson and FSU. Well, of course, they've always been in talks with Clemson and FSU. There's this discussion about perhaps, or they're setting aside money to increase the payouts, having a disproportionate pay to some of the members. Well, of course, that's what we've been talking about all along. That should have been hammered out prior to this extension. What we don't know is how much. Is it $1, $1 million, $10 million? You did a great job on your earlier college addiction show showing just how big the disparity is. So we'll talk about that in a moment. I want to put a pin in that before I go into the details. But what I suspect, what I believe to be happening in the rooms, in the backgrounds, is the parties have a memorandum of understanding or a series of bullet points. And those are the high level basic frameworks for a deal. I have to believe that they have at least gotten that far down the process of negotiating before ESPN would feel comfortable enough to sign this. The alternative is that ESPN was going to sign this regardless of what was going on with the litigation. So I don't think that's true. And I clearly don't think that a settlement is imminent, or they would have announced it today and then waited till tomorrow to extend the agreement. So we're still a ways away from any type of settlement in the litigation. I believe that there is a written framework exchange between the parties of what the general deal is going to be, but sometimes it does take a while to put all of the details and minutia in the contracts so that you have a full-fledged settlement agreement that the parties can sign. I'm hoping we're just in those muddy waters, and for those who are crying foul, for those FSU fans who are desperate for more details and more information, we just have to wait. We have to wait and see what is in the details of any agreement that ultimately gets hammered out.
The two big maybe sticking points, and maybe this will dive some into the money when we talk about it, the two big things that seem to be in discussion are the two things that have been in discussion since early 2023 when Michael Alford brought this up. One hand, you have unequal revenue sharing, which is really the crux of what Florida State asked for well before, literally almost a year before filing any type of litigation, 6 months before that explosive, Board of Trustees meeting. Unequal revenue sharing on one hand, and on the other hand, you're looking at maybe a paring down of the number of years that would be left on the grant of rights. And I saw Hale mention that. I know Ross Dellinger mentioned that. And, we've talked at times, is that if that is the case, right? If they do some kind of unequal revenue sharing, we can talk about what those numbers look like in a minute. If they do chop 5-6 years off the end of the grant of rights to get you out faster, I mean, that is in essence a compromise, right? Like that is both sides giving up a little bit, neither one getting fully what they want. Obviously, we want to be out tomorrow playing a Big Ten schedule in 2025. That's not happening, right? So it's somewhere in the middle of all of that. And is it what we wanted? Is it what the ACC wanted? I mean, probably not. But it's kind of, if that's the way it works out, that is by definition a compromise.
If you go back and watch your videos with me early on before Ireland, that seems like an age ago, but the conversation last time was that if there is a quick resolution, which is a very big if, but if there was going to be a quick resolution, it was likely going to take place after the August 15th deadline and before the start of the school year season. And why? Why was that the prevailing thought? Because we'd just gone through conference realignment with Texas and Oklahoma. We had just gotten to the point where the litigation had been filed and the ACC knew FSU was serious about this. That passing of that August 15th deadline was going to mean that we were going to play the 24-25 season in the ACC conference. And I suspected that any agreement would also include an additional year of 2026 in the conference. So when we were talking early on about best case scenario, we were still going to be in the ACC through 2026. Now, with them considering reducing the grant of rights down from the 2036 time period to the 2031 time period, you're still entering an area realm where you can have negotiations in 2027 and 2028 for a departure. So just the fact that we're bringing that down from 2036 to 2031 is a good deal if, and that's a big if to add to this, there is also the additional revenue sharing. But let's talk about the realities of that. You did a good job earlier, as I mentioned on your show, talking about the difference. In 2029, the SEC is getting $105 million. The ACC is getting $55 million. So let's say hypothetically they figure out a way to come up with $20 million, $25 million. Well, it's not going to go just to one member of the conference. 2, 3, 4, the top 4 viewers in the conference are going to be splitting that money. So, okay, they're able to put an extra $5, maybe $10 million if we're ambitious into our pockets. There's still a $50 million gap between the individual conferences. Now, let me ask you this. Is this figure total or per team that you outlined? Is the SEC getting $105 million per team, or is the SEC getting $105 million in aggregate? I think it's per
No.
team.
Yeah, that's per team. Yeah, for
Right.
sure. Because
So we're not
the total number is like 1.5 billion or something for the
right.
SEC.
These are ridiculous numbers that we're talking about, and it's aspirational that the ACC has put pen to paper in some memorandum saying, "Okay, we'll pay more." But it's not going to be anywhere near what needs to be paid. So that's why it is a gut check moment for me. It is very disappointing. I was really hoping that we would have an earlier departure than 2031, 2027, 2028. I'm not sure that's in the cards at this point.
I want to ask a little bit more about that and a little bit more on the litigation side. Another point that I want to bring up on the money. I don't have the specific tweet. I don't have the specific article that it came out of, but I remember the numbers. President Alford talked about how we account. AD Alford talked about how we account for 15% of the eyeballs that, and I remember the number specifically. He and I actually talked about them too. 15% of the eyeballs in this conference, and we get paid out 7% of the payout. And so in theory, and David Hale of ESPN has tweeted that this is not going to be the case. It's not going to be straight TV eyeballs to dollars, but TV will be a factor. In theory, if it was straight TV eyeballs to dollars, right? And Alford's numbers are correct that we account for about 15% of the eyeballs in the ACC. That would have me hopeful that they could, in theory, and I don't think they will. I'm not trying to paint this as a super bright picture, but if that was an apples to apples comparison and the numbers were right, that would have me somewhat hopeful that they could extend it by quite a bit, that they could give us quite a bit of money. Because if you think we're getting 35, 40 million for 7%, If we then get a cut of 15%, I mean, that's roughly doubling, right? So maybe we could get up to that 70, 80 million. I don't anticipate that. I'll tell you right now, I'd be shocked with 20 million. If they gave us even plus 20, I'd be, I mean, not thrilled from the perspective of we're still 30 million behind the SEC, but thrilled from the perspective of that is way more than I actually think we're going to get.
Even plus 20 million, and we're done after the 2027 season. I'd sign up for that all day long. I
100%.
just don't think that's where this is going. The one problem with what you mentioned about apportioning it per eyeballs is that is going to require membership approval. And
Mhm.
anything that requires membership approval is not going to get any type of consensus. So what they're talking about doing and hinting about doing is maybe ESPN is kicking in some additional revenue, which already is contrary to their goal, which is to extend the ACC deadline or a contract because it is so cheap. So they're not going to be altruistic and grant a whole lot more money. But let's say hypothetically they grant some more money. Again, is it $10 million a year, $15 million a year? Then that is split between the top three, top four eyeball earners. They're not going to double FSU's
Right.
revenue. They're not going to increase by 25% FSU's revenue. We're talking about a nominal amount set aside in a separate account that they then don't need the membership to approve, that they can dole out based on some predetermined percentage, which according to the publicity put out by Georgia Tech today, they were the number one viewership, team in the ACC for the entire 2024 college football season, starting with Florida State and ending with Georgia. Certainly helps, but technically they were the ratings winners for the conference. So congratulations, Georgia Tech gets the largest share of this bulk extra TV dollars that are set aside. Again, I'm hopeful. I'm anticipating. I'll wait to cry about it until we know what the details are. But I don't see ESPN injecting an extra 50 million or 100 million into the ACC coffers per year.
Yeah. Even if it was 100 million and Alfred's numbers are correct and we make up 15% of that, it's 15 million, right? And that
Mm-hmm.
is still $35 million less, not at the start, right? It'd be $25 million less like these next couple of years. It would still be not anywhere close to what you theoretically need to get to be closer. And that's well before, I didn't really go into this a ton on the college football video earlier. That's well before you talk about the playoff, and the SEC
Yep.
probably about to have 4 teams guaranteed to be in, and the ACC holding on to their most likely one. I know they snuck 2 in this year. There will be no years that the ACC sneaks 3 in. And not only do you have less teams in, you have less of a payout. The ACC payout is lower than the SEC, so you're fighting an uphill battle on both sides. The money side of this, now the years to me is a win. It's not the win we wanted. The money side is, I mean, it's a win, right? It's walking the 4-hole hitter, with 2 guys on base. It's a win because you got on base, but the 5 guy strikes out, right? Like that's to me, the money side is very much like you got 8. I told Harlan earlier, you got 8 yards on 3rd and 10,
Yeah.
right?
That's what I was going to mention. You did a great job with that analogy. You had a nice play. It was a great swing pass or jet sweep. And if it was first down, it would have looked beautiful, but it was 3rd and 10 and you got 9 yards and it's just not enough.
Um, so the other side of this that I want to talk about is the litigation. If a settlement, and I guess maybe there are different ways to look at it, but if a settlement happens and if Florida State and Clemson agree to something, is there any way possible for either program or either school to continue on with litigation, or would that almost certainly be part of the settlement or agreement?
Yeah, the settlement is in lieu of pursuing litigation. That's what the settlement is going to resolve. There's no way that you have some kind of an agreement, but the litigation remains in effect. And as you've seen, we broke down yesterday the brief to the Florida Supreme Court, which is before Florida State has 30 days to file their brief to the Florida Supreme Court, which then may or may not take up the case and have oral arguments scheduled for 30 or 60 days from now, which will then take 4 months to render their decision. So sometime in August, we're getting to hear what the Florida Supreme Court case thinks about last year's Judge Cooper's orders. The best case scenario in that situation is the Supreme Court of Florida declines to hear the case. They just validate the lower court opinions by not getting involved, and then the case moves on to the discovery phase in Florida. But again, we're still talking months and months, if not another year or two, before there's any substantive ruling in Florida that affects the litigation in any way. So I go back to our first video. This is going to end in settlement. It's just a matter of when and what the terms are.
Now we've heard, are you hopeful, not necessarily from a legal perspective, but are you hopeful that maybe this somehow still gets worked out? Like now that ESPN has kind of everything back in line their way, that they could maybe move pieces around. I know our friends over at the Big Mountain talked about this a little last night. I'm not sure if you caught it or not, but is there any way? Yeah. Mine's right here just because you can't see it behind me. It's too small, too far away. But are any thoughts that ESPN could still save us before 2030?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think they had some very insightful suggestions, and I think that they made sense. Again, we've said it from the beginning. Florida State is an ESPN property, and so transitioning them over to the SEC and keeping them in ESPN property has always been one of the likely scenarios. They're playing defense against Fox, who allegedly wants to get Miami in a Florida footprint. So everything they said last night and yesterday's show seemed plausible and reasonable, and I have no reason to call BS on anything they said. I'm less concerned now about the timing as I am about this wide gulf in dollars that I just don't see how it gets made up without a substantial investment on ESPN's part.
Yeah. And we talk about that and people say, oh, well, it's $25 million, but you still bring in money from this, money from that. Florida State still does pretty well. It is $25 million. It is, $30-40 million per, but over 6 years, I mean, you're talking $40 million over 6 years. You're talking about $250 million, but further behind for a younger program, a smaller school than the University of Florida, like, just not the same donor base. And so, yeah, it is. The revenue gap is most assuredly the scariest part. If you told me we were making the same money as the SEC and Big Ten until 2030, or even comparable, I'd say, all right, we'll eat our lumps until 2030 and we'll just get out.
The biggest way to close that gap, the fastest way to close that gap, is as part of this memorandum of understanding that is the basic framework for future agreements. The ACC has basically said we're agreeing to let Clemson and FSU walk, because we've set aside the $150-200 million for the exit fees and for the litigation. So if there's a scenario where the ACC says, okay, as part of all of these moving pieces, one of the things that we're prepared for is to bring that penalty for the grant of rights down to zero and to bring the buyout down to zero as a favor to ESPN. Okay, then that $150 million we'd set aside for whatever agreement now gets used to offset those differences. That's a workable solution. But you have to then ask yourself, why would the ACC agree to that? The ACC, as we've said from the beginning, is staring extinction in the face until we figure out what is going to be happening with conference realignment in 2032. Either they're going to absorb the Big 12, either they're going to absorb a bunch of G5 teams and be a permanent second-tier member, a second-class member of the Power 5 conference or Power 4 conferences, or we're going to have the SEC and Big Ten break off. Those are the questions we don't have answers to, and we can't speculate. But to close that $20, $30, $40 million per year gap is going to require ESPN and the ACC as part of this push to say, okay, we're going to pay you through 2036, but we want FSU and the SEC, and you're going to let them walk in 2029.
Yeah. The interesting part of this is, we've heard so many, I even got a comment on it today on the College Football Addiction channel. I guess that grant of rights really was ironclad. I guess it really was airtight. And I commented back and I said, well, then why are they letting us walk in 2030? Now that hasn't happened yet. I'm not breaking that news. But like, if that's the case, then I mean, come on. Like we had a little bit of a thing here. And that goes back to what we talked about, it being a bit of a compromise on both sides. Anything else high level or anything else? I did have one other question, not related to this directly, but one other question with some stuff going on in the state of Florida. I don't know if you have an opinion on, but any other things high level on this ACC ESPN stuff?
We saw a lot of criticism on Twitter today about the FSU leadership and how they'd allow this to happen. FSU leadership has nothing to do with this particular decision. This is
Sure.
ESPN and ESPN unilaterally deciding whether or not to pick up their option with the ACC. So today's decision, today's actions have no bearing on the litigation, have no consequences on where FSU has positioned itself up to this date, and really involve no action on the part of FSU. So yesterday and today are basically the same from a litigation standpoint. Let's wait and see how this domino affects those settlement negotiations.
Florida State hasn't agreed to anything yet that I'm aware of. Now, maybe in principle, maybe there's framework like you talked about, but as far as I'm aware, nothing's been signed by Florida State saying we agree to be here longer or or whatever, right? Like they haven't dropped litigation. I know some folks very much think that they won't, that maybe this is, I do think the messaging from Dellinger and I said this on the video and from Hale is coming from Charlotte. And so we'll see. We'll see if there's a Florida State response. If now Florida State comes out and agrees to be in here till 2036, we'll all get our pitchforks out and be upset. Right. But yeah, exactly. Go break open that one from Dublin up there. But but we'll hold on before we fire the whole board of trustees and get President McCullough and everybody else out too. One other thing, and this is not super related to this, but kind of, as an alum, as a marching chief, as not just a football fan, right? Like I know you love football and baseball and all the sports. What are your thoughts on Andrea Adelson tweeted out that Alford and McCullough and Peter Collins, I think were all in Jacksonville talking with the state about essentially taking funds from the university to help with this revenue share or this the revenue sharing with athletes, not the revenue share in the ACC. Just thoughts on that in general, just kind of all encompassing thoughts, legal perspective, personal perspective, alumni perspective, all that.
Well, my first concern is that we get into a situation where Miami was robbing money from their School of Medicine to pay NIL and athletes. And, we don't want to have that type of PR problem. But the House settlement is in flux. It's very unclear as to what exactly is going to be going on, if it's even going to make it across the finish line. I heard Ted Cruz is getting involved. There's going to be some legislation that comes through. We've got to see how that affects different aspects of it. But I'll go back to what I was saying from the beginning on the House settlement issue. The biggest obstacle we have to any solution is how does this impact and how can it possibly arrest the rights of future athletes? You have the collective bargaining agreement in the NFL. Any member or any player becomes a member of that union automatically and are subject to their rules. That doesn't apply in amateurism. And again, we're using those in quotation marks. How does an eighth grader today have to be, prohibited from or capped in some way by some House settlement agreement that was approved long before he got into high school? That's the big question that needs to be solved when it comes to deciding what really is going to be happening with revenue sharing in the future, Title IX implications. It's just a hot mess. As far as using booster or university funds, I don't see any way around it. They're going to have to use their funds from all kinds of resources in order to fund the types of dollar figures that they're mentioning. But at the end of the day, the boosters are the boosters and the alumni are the alumni, and you're either supporting the team or not supporting the team. You're either just an armchair couch fan cheering rah 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 with face paint, or you're in there putting some hard earned dollars towards the success of the program. Now we can talk about whether or not that's fair. We can talk about, especially with the invention of NIL and how much the fans have to pay booster fees, have to pay season ticket prices, have to now also pay for rosters. I agree with those people who are just lamenting the 80s and 90s and the glory days of college football. But this is the reality of the economics we're in today. And you either want to participate or don't want to participate. You're not obligated to make the decision that makes you happy and that makes sense for you and your family, and especially if we're facing economic headwinds. But what is frustrating to me is the bitching and moaning on Twitter just for the sake of bitching and moaning. Either come along for the ride and watch and see what's going to happen. You're welcome to share your opinions, but some people just don't like being happy, and for those people, I feel sorry for them. That's just the way they live their life.
It's too much of that application. It's too much of our world. It's not just Twitter, but it does get magnified on Twitter. No, and I agree with you. Again, going back to the college football addiction video, somebody commented, Florida State will be fine. They'll still make more, even with the revenue sharing. They'll still make more than the likes of Arkansas and South Carolina were two schools they mentioned specifically. And I said, like, frankly, if we're competing with Florida, if with Arkansas and South Carolina, then we just need to hang it up. Like that's not who Florida State aspires to hang out with. And so the boosters aren't paying me. Ingram's not paying me to say this, Michael Albert. But if you don't want to compete with the Arkansas and the South Carolinas, then get off of Twitter and maybe go call the boosters. And another, I won't bow breach you so much, but it'll be cheaper to become a booster and buy season tickets this year than it will be to just go to the Alabama game. So not a bad investment
That's
from
true.
that perspective either. So sign up for
It's
a
true.
$70 booster fee and get a couple of tickets to the Bama game and upset the Crimson Tide. So, Doug, tell us about Rohan Law. Let's get out of here before I get in trouble.
Yeah, we're in Atlanta, Georgia. Personal injury, workers' compensation, criminal defense. Dealing with a lot with that as we start off this year. That's really exploding. Good people make poor choices sometimes, and it's necessary for us to come alongside you because here at Rohan Law, we want to be your best friends on your worst day. So if you're calling our office, it's not because everything is great. It's not because FSU just got out of the ACC. It's not because we just tripled our revenue. It's because, unfortunately, you're facing a lot of pain or a lot of fear about your freedom and your future. And so our law firm specializes in coming alongside you and helping you out. So if you need a Noel to answer some questions and you're in Atlanta or anywhere in Georgia, give us a phone call and we'll be happy to help you out.
The day we do get out of the ACC, though, I want you guys to blow up Doug's phone line and schedule happy hours with him because he'll schedule them for the next 2 months every day. So you won't see the family again for 2 months, but you'll be at happy hour with Doug. So, Doug, I appreciate you for hanging out, man.
My pleasure. You all have a good day. Take care.